In a house that stood on a gentle street, where elm trees grew at regular intervals, there lived ordinary people who woke each morning and attended to the tasks that filled their days. This house had been standing for a very long time, and the ways that people moved through its rooms had changed in small ways, year after year, so gradually that no one noticed the shifting from one season to the next. In the late 1800s, when the house was still quite new, the morning began before the sun had fully risen. Someone would walk down the stairs, moving slowly in the dim light, and make their way to the kitchen where the stove stood cold and silent. The stove was made of heavy iron, with ornate designs pressed into its surface, and it required careful attention each morning. First, the ashes from the previous day needed to be removed, a task that involved opening the small door at the bottom and using a metal scoop to lift out the gray powder, which was soft and light and floated slightly in the air before settling into a metal pail. After the ashes were cleared away, small pieces of kindling were arranged inside the stove, thin strips of wood that had been split and set aside for this purpose. The kindling was placed in a careful pattern, with space between each piece so that air could move through, and then crumpled paper was tucked underneath. A match was struck, and the paper caught fire, and the small flames began to reach toward the kindling, which took longer to ignite, and the person attending to the stove would wait, watching to ensure the fire took hold before adding slightly larger pieces of wood. This process of building the fire took time, and there was a particular rhythm to it, a sequence of small actions that required patience and attention. Once the fire was burning steadily, the person could begin to prepare breakfast, but the stove needed time to heat, and so there was often a period of waiting, of standing in the kitchen as the room gradually grew warmer and the sky outside slowly became lighter. Water for washing and cooking had to be brought into the house, carried in buckets from a well or a pump that stood outside. The buckets were heavy, especially when full, and they had to be carried carefully to avoid spilling. In winter, the water was very cold, and sometimes there was ice that needed to be broken. In summer, the water was cool and pleasant, though the buckets were no lighter regardless of the season. The dishes from the previous evening's meal would be waiting, stacked beside a basin. Water would be heated on the stove, poured into the basin, and then each dish would be washed by hand, with soap that had often been made at home from lye and animal fat. The soap was harsh and dried the hands, and the water cooled as the washing continued, so sometimes more hot water needed to be added. Each dish was scrubbed and rinsed, and then set aside to dry on a clean cloth that had been laid out for this purpose. Clothing, too, required a great deal of time and effort. On a designated day each week, usually Monday, the washing would be done. Water had to be heated in large pots on the stove, bucket after bucket poured in and brought to a boil. The clothes were sorted by color and fabric, and then placed into a large tub where they were scrubbed against a washboard, a wooden frame with a ridged metal surface. The person washing would take each garment, rub soap into it, and then move it up and down against the washboard's ridges, working to loosen the dirt and stains. The water in the tub would become gray and cloudy, and after the clothes had been scrubbed, they needed to be rinsed in clean water, and sometimes rinsed again in a second tub of water to ensure all the soap was removed. Then each piece of clothing had to be wrung out, twisted tightly to remove as much water as possible, which required strong hands and left them aching. Finally, the clothes were carried outside and hung on lines strung between posts. where they would dry in the sun and wind, moving slightly and making soft sounds as the breeze passed through them. If it rained, the clothes had to be brought inside quickly and hung near the stove, which made the house damp and filled it with the smell of wet fabric. In winter, the clothes froze on the line and had to be brought in stiff and cold, then arranged near the stove to thaw and finish drying. Ironing was done with heavy flatirons that sat on the stove to heat. These were solid metal, with a handle that could become hot to the touch, and they required a thick cloth to hold safely. The iron was tested by bringing it close to the face to feel the heat radiating from it, or by dampening a finger and touching it quickly to hear the sizzle. If it was too hot, it could scorch the fabric, leaving brown marks, so it needed to be just the right temperature. Each garment was smoothed carefully, pressed flat against a padded surface, and the iron was moved slowly back and forth, making the wrinkles disappear and leaving the fabric smooth and neat. The floors of the house needed regular attention. Carpets, if there were any, had to be taken outside and beaten with a carpet beater, a tool made of twisted wire or rattan that was shaped into a large paddle. The carpet would be hung over a line or draped over a fence, and then struck repeatedly, which raised clouds of dust that drifted away on the air. This was tiring work, requiring the same motion over and over, and it took a long time to work through even a small carpet. Floors that were not covered with carpets were swept with a broom made of straw or twigs bound together, and the sweeping had to be done carefully to move the dust and dirt toward the door without raising too much of it into the air. After sweeping, the floors might be scrubbed with a brush and water, and then left to dry, with windows opened to help the air move through. Lighting in the evening required preparation during the day. Oil lamps needed their reservoirs filled with kerosene, their wicks trimmed to the right length so they would burn evenly without smoking, and their glass chimneys cleaned of the black soot that accumulated. Candles were used as well, and these had to be checked and replaced when they burned down. The light from these sources was soft and warm, but also dim, creating circles of light that didn't reach the corners of rooms, and people moved between these pools of brightness, their shadows stretching and shifting on the walls. Food preparation consumed many hours of each day. Bread was baked at home, which meant the yeast needed to be kept alive and fed. The dough mixed and kneaded, left to rise in a warm place, then shaped and baked in the oven of the wood stove, where the temperature could only be judged by experience and attention. Vegetables were prepared by hand, peeled with small knives, chopped on wooden boards, and the scraps collected for animals or compost. Preserving food for winter meant long days of work in late summer and autumn. Vegetables were canned in glass jars, a process that involved cleaning and preparing the produce, packing it into jars with salt or vinegar or syrup, then sealing the jars and processing them in boiling water to ensure they wouldn't spoil. Fruits were made into jams and jellies, cooked slowly with sugar until they thickened, then poured into jars and sealed with paraffin wax. The kitchen would be hot and steamy during these days, with every surface covered with jars and bowls and pots, and the sweet or savory smells filling the house. As the years passed, slowly and without fanfare, small changes came to the house and to the tools used within it. The heavy iron stove was eventually replaced with one that had more refined controls, and later still, with a stove that burned coal instead of wood, which required less constant attention, though it still needed to be fed and its ashes removed. Later still came stoves that connected to gas lines, with burners that could be lit with a match and adjusted with a knob, providing heat immediately without the need to build a fire and wait. Water began to come into the house through pipes, which meant no more carrying buckets from outside. At first, there might be just one tap, perhaps in the kitchen, but over time more were added. And eventually there was hot water that came from a heater, so water no longer needed to be heated on the stove for washing. This changed the rhythm of morning and evening tasks, removing the periods of waiting and carrying that had structured the day. The washing of clothes became easier with the introduction of mechanical devices. First came hand-cranked washing machines, which were still filled manually with water and emptied with a bucket. But the clothes were agitated by paddles inside the machine, turned by cranking a handle back and forth, which was less exhausting than scrubbing each item by hand. Later came electric washing machines that did this work automatically, filling themselves with water and moving the clothes through cycles of washing and rinsing without requiring constant attention. Wringers were attached to these machines, two rollers pressed together that could be cranked by hand to squeeze water from the clothes more efficiently than twisting them could, though fingers had to be kept well clear of the rollers. Eventually, machines included a spinning function that removed even more water, making the clothes lighter and helping them dry more quickly. Ironing changed to electric irons appeared, which heated themselves and maintained a steady temperature and didn't need to be returned to a stove to reheat. They were lighter and easier to use, and some could produce steam, which helped smooth wrinkles more effectively. The time spent on ironing decreased, and some fabrics were developed that required less ironing or none at all, which changed what people chose to wear and how often things needed to be pressed. The care of floors was transformed by the vacuum cleaner, which at first was a large and cumbersome device that might be powered by hand or by a small motor. Early models were heavy and difficult to move, but they could pull dust and dirt from carpets more thoroughly than beating them could, and they worked more quickly. As these machines improved, they became lighter and more efficient, and the weekly ritual of taking carpets outside became less common, eventually disappearing entirely from most households. Refrigerators replaced iceboxes, which had required regular deliveries of ice that melted and needed to be drained. The refrigerator kept food cold reliably, without attention, and made it possible to store fresh food for longer periods. Freezers allowed for even longer storage, and the patterns of shopping and meal planning changed. With fewer trips to markets and more food kept in the home, the preparation of food was aided by new tools as well. Electric mixers replaced the hand beating of eggs and cream, which had required strong arms and patience. Blenders could puree and chop. Toasters browned bread evenly without the need to watch it carefully near a flame. Each of these tools was small in itself, but together they reduced the time and effort required to prepare meals, and they changed what meals were possible to make regularly. Dishwashers eventually appeared, machines that washed and rinsed dishes automatically, though they required the dishes to be arranged in racks in a particular way, and they needed to be loaded and unloaded, and sometimes dishes needed to be rinsed before being placed inside. But the time spent standing at a sink with hands in water decreased, and the process became less central to the rhythm of evening in the household. Lighting changed perhaps more dramatically than anything else. Electric lights began to replace oil lamps and candles, at first with bare bulbs hanging from ceiling fixtures, later with shaded lamps and more sophisticated fixtures. These lights were brighter and could be turned on and off with a switch. And they required no daily preparation or maintenance, no filling of reservoirs or trimming of wicks. The darkness of evening was pushed back further into the corners of rooms, and people could more easily move through the house after sunset. Heating systems evolved from stoves that heated only the rooms they were in, requiring doors to be left open for warmth to spread, to central heating systems that warmed the entire house more evenly. Thermostats allowed temperature to be controlled precisely, and the house could be kept at a comfortable level without constant attention to fires and fuel. In the house on the gentle street, these changes accumulated so gradually that they were barely noticed by those who lived there. One tool would wear out and be replaced by a newer version, or a neighbor would mention a device they'd acquired, and soon others would have them too. The younger people who grew up in the house often didn't remember the older ways of doing things. And when the older people spoke of carrying water or building fires each morning, it seemed like stories from a distant time, even though it had only been a few decades. The time that had once been spent on maintaining the household was still filled, but now with different activities. There was more time for other work, for reading, for visiting with neighbors, for hobbies and interests. The daily rhythm changed, became less tied to the natural cycles of fire and water and daylight, more flexible and varied. A person could wake later because there was no fire to build before breakfast could be made. They could prepare a meal more quickly, with less planning and less time spent on each step. The evening tasks that had once consumed hours could be completed more swiftly or postponed without consequence. The household became easier to maintain, and the tools became more reliable, requiring less skill to operate effectively. Yet some things remained much the same. Dishes still needed to be washed, whether by hand or machine. Clothes still needed to be laundered. Floors still accumulated dust. Food still needed to be prepared. The tools had changed. The time required had decreased, but the fundamental tasks persisted, day after day, week after week, season after season. In the mornings now, someone might wake and walk to the kitchen and press a button to start a coffee maker that had been prepared the night before. They might open the refrigerator and remove milk that had been bought several days ago and was still fresh. They might place bread in a toaster and press a lever and wait a minute for it to brown. The newspaper might be retrieved from the front step, or the morning might be spent looking at a screen that showed news and messages from far away. The dishes from breakfast might be rinsed and placed in a dishwasher, or washed quickly by hand if there were only a few. The counter might be wiped with a cloth. The coffee maker might be switched off. These small acts of maintenance, of keeping the household in order, continued as they always had, but they occupied less time and required less physical effort than they once did. Laundry might be started by gathering clothes from various rooms and sorting them by color or fabric type, then placing a load into the washing machine, adding detergent from a bottle, and pressing buttons or turning dials to select settings. The machine would fill itself with water and proceed through its cycles, and an hour later the clothes would be moved to a dryer, where hot air would tumble them until they were dry. Some clothes might be hung on hangers immediately to avoid wrinkles, while others might be folded and put away. The vacuuming might be done by pushing a machine back and forth across carpets and floors, the motor humming steadily, the dust and dirt pulled up and collected in a bag that would eventually need to be emptied. The machine might bump against furniture, might need to be unplugged and plugged in again in different rooms, might require the cord to be wound up when finished. But the task that had once taken most of a day could now be completed in less than an hour. The preparation of an evening meal might involve looking in the refrigerator and pantry to see what was available, perhaps consulting a recipe in a book or on a screen, then following a series of steps that combined ingredients in particular ways. Vegetables might be chopped on a cutting board, using knives that were sharper than those used a century before. Pans might be placed on burners that heated quickly to precise temperatures. Timers might be set to ensure nothing overcooked. The meal would come together gradually, and the kitchen would fill with the smells of cooking, and when it was ready, it would be served on dishes that would later be cleared and washed. In the evening, after the tasks were completed, there might be time to sit and rest. The lights would be on, bright and steady. The house would be a comfortable temperature. Outside, the street would be quiet, the elm trees moving slightly in whatever breeze was passing through. Other houses would have their lights on too, glowing softly in the gathering darkness. Someone might read a book, the pages turning quietly. Someone might work on a hobby, sewing or woodworking or drawing. Someone might simply sit and think, watching the patterns of light and shadow on the wall, listening to the small sounds of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing. The seasons would continue their slow progression. Winter would come, and the house would be kept warm. Spring would arrive, and windows would be opened to let in fresh air. Summer would bring longer days and the sound of insects in the evening. Autumn would turn the leaves and bring cooler temperatures, and the cycle would continue year after year. The tools in the house would gradually be replaced as they wore out or as new versions appeared that worked more efficiently. The ways of doing the daily tasks would continue to change, but always slowly, so that the changes were barely perceptible from one year to the next. The people who lived in the house would grow older, and younger people would come to live there too, and they would all participate in the quiet maintenance of the household, the simple tasks that filled the hours and days. And through all of this, the house would stand on its gentle street, where the elm trees grew at regular intervals, their branches reaching upward and their leaves rustling softly in the breeze, a sound like water moving over stones, peaceful and constant and familiar, continuing on into the quiet evening, into the approaching night, into the restful darkness where all the small tasks of the day were completed and set aside until morning would come again and they would begin once more. The rhythm of these days was gentle and predictable. There was a comfort in the repetition, in knowing what needed to be done and doing it. In the slow progression from morning to evening, the tools made the work easier, but the work itself remained a steady presence that structured time and gave shape to the days. And so the time passed, quietly and without urgency, each day very much like the one before it and the one that would follow, peaceful and ordinary, filled with the small actions that maintained the household and the lives of those who lived within it, continuing on in a gentle rhythm that asked nothing more than attention to these simple, necessary tasks, these quiet turnings of daily hours, these soft and steady movements through familiar rooms, through ordinary time, through the peaceful succession of days that stretched out behind and ahead, all very much the same, all very calm, all very still,